Hello and welcome to this introduction lecture, and in this introduction lecture we are going to cover some basic concepts about what is SQL and what are databases. So SQL basically stands for Structured Query Language, and SQL is a language which allows us to communicate with the databases. Now the most important thing which we need to understand here is that why do we actually need databases, and this lecture is exactly going to tell you the same. So let's first take a simple example. So whenever you are designing any software or any website for the matter, you will have something which is called as the user interface, and the user interface is nothing but it is like a window of your software, window of your application, or it is going to be the landing page of your website or anything like that. So what happens is that the data which is entered into the user interface actually gets captured and it actually gets stored into the database, which is nothing but the backend. So if we talk about any website or any application, it consists of two parts. The first part or the front end is called as the user interface. So user interface is something with which the user interacts and which the user is able to look at, and at the back end we have the database which actually stores the data entered by the user. Now let's take a simple example. So let's say this is your website and this is a user. So the user is obviously going to interact with the website, and now the user actually has data. So for example, the user has his name, which is John, his age is 25, and let's consider his gender is male and the location is United States, and he is an engineer. So in case of your website, what happens is that as your website is going to store information related to users, you actually need to have a way to store the data. So similar to John, there are multiple other users, and what you need to actually do is that you need to store data related to each and every user. For example, this user right here is going to have a different set of data. This user is going to have his own set of data, so on and so forth. So this is what the actual scenario looks like. So here we have our user and here we have our interface. So let's consider that this user interface is nothing but, let's say, a sign up form in which the user actually fills in his information. So essentially the user is passing on data to the user interface. So once the user enters his data into the user interface, that is nothing but the sign up form, what happens in reality is that that data is transferred to the database and the data is actually stored into this database right here. So the data flow takes place in this way. The user actually enters his data into this form captures the data and sends it over to the database. Now let's learn how the data is actually stored into the database. So instead of storing the data randomly into the database, what we do here is that we create something which is called as tables, and the data related to a person is actually stored in the form of tables. So here, as we need to save the name, age, gender and location of a person, what we do here is that in database we design a table having the following columns, which is name, age, gender and location, and the information for each and every person is inserted into the database in form of a row. So for example, if you have to find the gender for Chris, so you could find Chris here and you could find gender here and you could identify that Chris is a male. So this is how the data is actually stored in the database in a tabular format, and we are going to go through this in a much more better way in the upcoming lectures. So here is the summary and some key points. So the first point is that databases are used to store the data related to any software, website or application. So as we have discussed, the purpose of databases is to store data when you are actually designing any software, any website, or let's say any mobile application. Databases helps us to manage the data efficiently without any issues. So the tabular structure of database actually allows us to store and retrieve data in a much more better way. Data in databases is stored in the form of a table. So basically, instead of randomly saving data, we make certain tables into the database, and then in those tables we actually save in the data. A single database can have multiple tables to store data from various categories. So in case of a database, we could go ahead and create multiple tables to store data related to multiple categories. So for example, as we wanted to store the data related to our website users, we could create a separate table for that. And let's say you also want to list out products on your website which you want to sell. So for that purpose, you could have a completely new table which is called as products. So that's it for this lecture, and I hope you guys understood why we actually need databases while creating any website, software or application. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Thank you.